Okay, thank you. All right, everybody got some coffee? Yeah? Well, I'm excited to have our panelists here, whom I'm going to introduce in just shortly. My name is Jeanette Dubinin. I'm the Director of Resilience and Adaptation here at CPEX. And I am so excited to talk with our panelists about something that is really dear to me, and that is climate action planning. I also wanted to say just quick housekeeping. If you're looking for continuing education credits, there is a continuing ed table in the foyer, and it's for planners, landscape architects, and lead professionals. So I think it's self-reporting, just sign in. And then I also wanted to thank our sponsors that you can find in our program. And without them, the summit would not have been possible. All right, on to our speakers. I would like to introduce Lakeisha, Tom, and Bennett, sitting in this order. Lakeisha Hart has over 20 years of engineering, project management, and planning experience. She serves as the state planning manager with the Louisiana Office of Planning and Budget within the Division of Administration. Her office is currently responsible for managing the state's EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. And you'll hear more about that in a minute. Tom Hazley has over 15 years of experience as a transportation planner and currently serves as a principal planner at the Regional Planning Commission. Tom leads the RPC's Climate Pollution Reduction Program and is poised to initiate the development of a regional transportation resilience improvement plan. And Bennett has joined us all the way from DC. She currently serves as the Bennett Hilly currently serves as the Senior Advisor for Housing and Sustainability in the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, in Washington, D.C. Prior to this role, Bennett served as the Deputy Director of the Office of Recapitalization, where she led the design and launch of the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. And really prior to that, she was a CPEXer. So welcome to all of you. And Lakeisha, you can go ahead and start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I'm Lakeisha Hart. I'm the state planning manager, as Jeanette said, with the Office of Planning and Budget. And I will be giving you guys an overview of the process that my office, along with some consultants, did to establish the Louisiana Priority Climate Action Plan, and then just give you a little bit of insight into some things that plan includes. And so first I'll get started with the funding source, which is EPA. So EPA last year awarded across the nation, basically made available to every state in Puerto Rico, a planning grant of $3 million to do climate action planning. In Louisiana, of course, we raised our hands and said yes. So the purpose of the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant is to provide grants to state and local governments to develop implementation plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful air pollutants. Again, like I said, it's a $3 million grant. In addition to, I'm good?
Yeah.
Okay. She gives me a look every now and then. We've been working together for a while. I was like, is that the look?
Listening.
Okay, so in addition to the state getting a $3 million grant, the New Orleans regional area and the Baton Rouge area also got a $1 million planning grant. The New Orleans Planning Commission is the one that's managing that grant for that area, and the Baton Rouge area, it's CRPC. So the first deliverable of that grant, which was submitted to EPA in January of this year, was a priority climate action plan. And the next deliverable is a comprehensive climate action plan. And the name that we have established for our plan is the CARE plan, the Comprehensive Action to Reduce Emissions Plan. Very general, right? And I think the goal of that plan is to do an update to the currently in place climate action plan that was completed under the previous administration. The goal of planning is to get towards projects for this particular grant to develop a plan to for phase one was to develop the plan. And so the second phase of the EPA grant is an actual implementation grant, which made available $4.6 billion for actual implementation projects. The main purpose of that, like I said, is to do projects that are implemented at the either state or local level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The caveat to that implementation grant is the project has to advance an initiative that's outlined in a priority climate action plan. And so, for example, if you live in North Louisiana and you wanted to submit a project for that, it had to align with the state's priority climate action plan. If you're lucky to live in the New Orleans area, you had the option. You could either align with the state climate action plan or you could align with the New Orleans area plan. Those applications were due in April of this year. The general award gave funding between $200 and $500 million, and then there was a tribal set aside for between $1 and $25 million. The program priorities you see on the screen, I won't read them. Basically, like I said, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, also to address environmental injustice and empower community-driven solutions. So I'll go over our planning process at the state level. We, of course, didn't want to recreate the wheel, so we started with what we had, which was the climate action plan that was completed a couple of years ago. We developed through this process from that plan, we teased out some priority focus areas. We went through a process of both community engagement, but also stakeholder engagement. So the community engagement meant going out to our local communities across the state to get feedback from them about what they felt like was important and what they prioritized in the realm of greenhouse gas reductions. But we also put together focus groups, which were subject matter experts, to get their feedback on implementation strategies and the feasibility of them. The other thing that we did was we got all of these things together. We took it through this process, and what we came out on the end was strategies, priorities, and focus areas that I'll get into in a few slides. A little bit about our outreach and engagement. The state agency coordination, this is just a list of the state agencies that were involved in the process of developing our priority climate action plan. Like I said earlier, our stakeholder engagement included kind of a three-pronged approach. We took existing interagency groups, which were formed around things like integration with the grid. There was a group that was formed around current climate pollution reduction actions. There were also focus groups that focused on things like ports, community resilience, transportation. And then we had targeted conversations with municipal leaders. We talked to some parish presidents and some mayors and their staff to get feedback directly from them about actions and priorities from their perspective. And all of that kind of formed the stakeholder input that we utilized in addition to our community engagement. So with the virtual focus groups, like I said, we were really targeting a group of subject matter experts that could really give us insight into some implementable near-term actions that we could take at the state level that would make an impact in reducing greenhouse gases. We also wanted to talk to them about how we can address these actions through the lens of equity, and then also get their input about sustainability and scalability. So we wanted to really focus on near term, like I said, where the focus is here in the near term, not that longer term focus of that broader climate action planning. This is just a map of the locations that we visited, kind of overlaid with the emission point sources across the state. And so the circles are the point sources. The bigger the circle, the larger the emissions. And then the stars represented places that we either connected with in person or virtually. We also did engagement with federal tribes to also get their input on what they saw as actions that they were passionate about and what they felt like what they felt were things that they were interested in implementing in their communities. So we visited the river parishes in person, Lake Charles and Shreveport, and then the other areas, Monroe, Alexandria, Lafayette. We visited, and we did also do a virtual with the municipal leaders in Lake Charles. This is just a graphic representation of the things that came out of and were discussed during our outreach. I think the importance really of outreach is to hear from local stakeholders and really get a sense of what's important to them. The thing that didn't surprise me, but kind of did surprise me, was going into a space as a state, as a member of a state agency, and just hearing it all. And some things were really relevant to the conversation. Like, yes, we care about reducing air emissions, and then some things were not as relevant. Like, I don't like the way that the train sounds when it's passing in my backyard. What can y'all do about it? But I think the important thing that we did was we really just listened. We let people talk, we heard them out, and then we found a way to have a conversation about things that mattered to them that were in this space of climate action. It's really important when you're engaging with people to meet them where they are and to figure out. I was listening to the panelist earlier, the doctor, and really there's this push-pull between, what's important for this person versus what's important for this person. And it's like we have to figure out how to accomplish our goals under a grant and under, working for a state agency, but also engaging with people in a way that matters to them. And to me, the community outreach and conversations and engagement and listening to people and actually taking their feedback into account and including it in your processes is the most important thing about the work that we do. And so on the next slide is just a summary of what we heard in the places that we visited. I think the thing that stood out the most was across Louisiana, different people in different areas have different priorities, right? And so in the river parishes where they have a lot more point sources than in other areas, you can see the things that were important to them were air quality, increased climate resilience. Those two stood out. But also in the Southwest, same thing. There are some, not as many, but some larger point sources in that area. Air quality stood out as one of the most important factors. But then when you got to the Northwest, the air quality was not necessarily the highest, the thing that they saw as the highest benefit. It was increased climate resilience. And so I think at a state level, when you're looking at implementing a program across the state, you have to figure out how to do that in a way that provides everybody across the state with benefits and do it in a way that's equitable and in a way where people who you engage with feel like their voice has been heard in that conversation. So all of the outreach and engagement we did led to a priority climate action plan, and I'll go over it quickly. Louisiana's focus areas. So we ended up with 13 focus areas, and these are just the big bucket sectors that have an impact across the state, where we can find ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They're all listed there, not in order of importance. As we all know, our biggest emitter is in the industrial sector. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So we ended up, like I said, with 13 focus areas. We had 29 priority outputs and 89 individual actions to address greenhouse gas emissions in the state. This is just an example of one of the focus areas. You can see the priority outputs and some of the priority actions. Community resilience hubs, of course, there is a lot of funding right now between IIJA and IRA in the space of energy efficiency and decarbonization. And one of the beneficial things of community resilience hubs is you're really able to target that community benefit in a way that you may not be able to do in other areas, and also provide wraparound services that are beneficial, post-disaster and things like that. And so one of the actions that we have is to deploy carbon-free microgrids, facilitate community-driven planning through a pilot program, and I won't go over the entire list. But just to give you an example, one of the things that Louisiana did to further this action is we actually applied for grant funding in order to implement this program. LDENR is actually in the beginning stages of a program called HERO, in which a lot of these actions will come to fruition. Just one more example, in industrial decarbonization, you can see some of the actions and outputs. At the state level, we don't own any oil and gas. We don't own any refineries or facilities like that. And so our piece of the puzzle really is to provide incentives for industry, work with them collaboratively to get on the same page about goals and priorities. And so, but we can put out there, hey, at the state level, these are the things that we would like to do, and work with industry to see how we can make that happen. Industry and the folks that we engage with have their own priorities and own actions in this space. And so it's really working with them, incorporating their planning processes and their technology switches and things like that into our modeling efforts, into our projections and things like that. And also rolling out programs to provide funding. A lot of times what we heard during conversations was that technology switch was not economically feasible. And from that standpoint, there are ways that the state can utilize federal dollars in order to infuse funding into some of those projects to make them kind of get over that hump. Pilot projects and programs, and once one gets over the hump, others get in line. And so our hope is that through some more federal funding, which again, LDENR has applied for, we are able to implement some programs that will allow industry to implement things in this larger scale to get across that hump of economic feasibility and get some of these projects off of the ground. In that lane, some things that we're looking at are N2O abatement programs, electrification and fuel switching programs, and some methane and I think it's on the next slide. Yes, methane emissions programs. So again, all of this currently at the state level is being run through LDENR. They did submit an application. Actually, they submitted 2 applications for the implementation funding from EPA. The award should be announced in the summer. And so hopefully we will begin to see some of this good work get off the ground. We've engaged with industry. They are excited about it, excited to participate, really excited to engage. And also the communities in and around those areas are really excited to see some of this stuff come to fruition. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. So again, I'm Tom Hazley. I would like to talk to you all about the Priority Climate Action Plan for the New Orleans metro region. I'm with the Regional Planning Commission. We took on the task of doing this. Before I get into everything, I realized I didn't include a slide covering our geography for this area. So obviously, Lakeisha was talking about the statewide plan. Our regional plan is the New Orleans metro area, which includes Jefferson, Orleans, Plaquemines, St. Bernard, St. Charles, St. James, St. John, St. Tammany, and Tangipahoa parishes. So 9 parishes. I have to count them or else I will forget one. But so kind of the toe of the boot, southeast Louisiana, that was our area. And just to set the stage a little bit, we had the same requirements as the statewide plan, exact same deliverables, including a greenhouse gas inventory. I just wanted to touch on ours really quickly. As Lakeisha mentioned, the greatest source of emissions statewide is industry, and that is also true in our region, in the New Orleans metro area. So industry followed by mobile combustion and electric power, which those two are about equal, which meant that as we were kind of selecting GHG reduction measures, we really wanted to try to prioritize those sectors as much as we could, although there's some difficulty in that, as I'll get into in a little while. Now, one interesting thing about that is when you compare our regional inventory to the state and to the rest of the nation, it actually looks pretty different. So on the right, you'll see our region, and in the center, you'll see the state. They look pretty similar. Industry is by far the largest emitter, followed by mobile combustion and electric power. On the left, you see the US GHG inventory. It's quite different. Industry, instead of 60%, as in our region, is only about 22%. And then mobile combustion and electric power take up a much larger share of that, which means that when you talk about GHG reduction measures nationwide, the conversation is a little bit different. When we talk about it here, we are talking about a lot about industry, but nationwide, it's a bit more of a mix. So I want to get into a little bit about how we selected our measures, and then maybe talk to y'all about what some of our priority measures are. So in terms of how we identified our measures, we really focused on the entities that would be eligible for CPRG implementation funds. So like Lakeisha said, in order to be eligible for those funds, the project basically needed to be listed in our PCAP, the Priority Climate Action Plan, which meant that we wanted to make sure that as many potentially eligible projects as possible were listed in that PCAP. Now, the thing about those grants, the implementation grants, is basically the only eligible applicants were government entities. So that meant that during our outreach process to gather projects, we had a large focus on government entities. So to get feedback from them, we had a couple different methods. We held some workshops, both in person and virtual. Those were actually pretty successful. We really felt like we got a lot of feedback from those. We were seeking kind of broad project concepts and specific projects. And what I mean by that is a broad concept could be increasing bike and pedestrian infrastructure. A specific project could be put in a bike path from this intersection to that intersection along this roadway. And we were taking both. We included both in our plan because we wanted to, again, kind of cast as wide a net as possible. We also sent out a survey to as many entities as we could identify, getting their general priorities as well as requesting projects, and then just a general email. We sent out an Excel template and asked, if you got anything, please send it to us. We had different responses to these. It really seemed like some people had a strong preference for a workshop or a strong preference for just giving me a spreadsheet, and that was totally fine. There was no problem at all with us as long as we got their feedback. So after all that, we got over 100 project concepts submitted. We had representation from nearly all of our parishes as well as some of our cities, including New Orleans and Gretna, some other agencies like the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, New Orleans Public Schools, the Regional Transit Authority. The ports were involved in this quite a bit. So we kind of took everything. We combined all those different project concepts that we got. As you could imagine, there was a lot of overlap. A lot of similar things were submitted to us. So what that ended up with was over 60, project concepts and over 100 discrete projects that were, location-specific, parish, city-specific projects. We also had many parishes and cities express interest in applying for those implementation grants. They did result in several grants getting submitted ultimately by April 1st. So we took all of those and we combined them into 16 overarching strategies that included 97 discrete implementation actions that we organized into 7 economic sectors. I heard Lakeisha say y'all had 89 actions, so we won, I guess. So some of the themes that we came up with, common themes that we heard kind of over and over and over, were transit, walking, and biking improvements, as well as fuel conversion and fleet transition projects. A lot of talk about renewable energy, especially solar, but also wind. And along with that, building retrofits and energy efficiency on buildings. We had a lot of conversation about urban forestry and marsh restoration, green infrastructure, bioremediation. That came up over and over and over again, as well as a lot of concerns about wastewater process improvements. I'll get into that a little bit more about why that was so important in our region. And then waste reduction, composting, recycling, things like that. So what this turned into, it almost looks like we stole this slide from Lakeisha. which we definitely did. This
We're partners.
exactly, yeah. So those 7 sectors that we ended up with, they're transportation, industry, energy, agriculture, wastewater, waste management, and then forestry, carbon sinks, carbon sequestration. And I'll warn you that the next couple of slides have a lot of text. I'm not going to read everything, but I do want to show you kind of what some of the examples are from all these different strategies and all these different sectors. So under transportation, which is at the Regional Planning Commission where I work, that's a lot of the work that we do. We had the 4 strategies of reducing vehicle miles traveled by increasing public transit, reduce vehicle miles traveled through non-motorized transportation, reducing congestion, and transitioning to low emissions vehicles. So I think the first 2 are fairly self-explanatory, expanding transit service and supporting non-motorized transportation. That's always been a major emphasis of our agency as a transportation planning entity. Reducing vehicular congestion, I think, gets a little less attention because if you can reduce vehicular congestion, you're reducing idling, you're improving fuel efficiency, essentially. That can positively impact GHG emissions. You have to be careful because you don't want to get induced demand and have more cars on the road. So that's a careful consideration there, but it is something that we included in our plan. And then our transition to low emissions vehicles, we have an existing clean fuels partnership. If y'all are familiar with Louisiana Clean Fuels, we have a partner agency housed within our agency, within the RPC, that is working on low emissions vehicles and alternative fuels. So under industry, all of our grant applicants, all of our governments that we work with are local governments, which means that they have very little regulatory authority over industry. So we recognize from the beginning that a lot of the strategies that we would want to implement need to come from a federal or state agency, and that includes a lot of the tax incentives and things like that. So when it came to coming up with industrial strategies, we tried to focus on what local governments could do. So we did talk about decarbonizing industrial processes, maybe through some kind of incentive programs tied to property taxes or permitting, things like that. And we also talked about mitigating emissions at industrial facilities, things like putting in green infrastructure, putting in urban forestry, stuff like that at industrial facilities and post-industrial facilities. Again, with energy, like industry, there's only so much we can do to regulate, but at least the energy production itself. But we did talk about expanding clean and renewable electric power generation through things like community solar. We included improving the efficiency and resilience of the electric power grid that we can work through with our local utilities for that. And also making buildings more efficient, particularly on government buildings, and establishing incentive programs for private owners. Under agriculture, our region, while it does have that urban core, there is a lot of agriculture in our region, particularly sugarcane. So we talked about maybe finding ways to reduce emissions from things like sugarcane burning, particularly at the mills. We kind of worked with DEQ and some of the other people that Lakeisha had worked with to come up with maybe what would be the reduction benefits of cutting back on that cane burning. We also talked about like converting passenger vehicles. What if we can convert farm equipment to cleaner, more efficient models? And then wastewater. So the reason I think wastewater became such an important topic in our region is that maybe this is true in a lot of other regions as well. In many of the areas where we've had a lot of growth in the past 20 or 30 years, there are many new subdivisions, many new developments that are basically all running on their own independent wastewater treatment systems. There is no centralized sewer for some of the parishes, and those treatment systems are not necessarily well maintained. They are a huge environmental issue, especially the ones that are now getting to be 30, 40, 50 years old. So it is a major problem, especially for our waterways, but they also represent a pretty significant GHG emission source. So that came up again and again and again, especially from our parishes who have a lot of these kind of systems. So we identified, just creating more efficient wastewater systems, and that's really centralizing our systems to the extent possible. But then also looking at the actual processes that are happening at those water treatment facilities. Materials management, I feel like that one's a lot more easily handleable by a local government through programs like reducing community waste, composting, recycling, but also reducing emissions from waste management processes. That one came up quite a bit as well. Better facilities, cleaner facilities. And then the last strategy, or the last sector, like I mentioned, was carbon removal and storage. This was huge. Everybody wants to build marshes. Everybody's very interested in urban forestry, and I think this one has obvious implications not just for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but for improving resilience, reducing storm surge. So a lot of co-benefits to this one. And we did, lean pretty hard on those natural processes, but we also recognized the potential for technological processes and reducing GHG through that and capturing carbon there. And I believe that's all I had, so thank you very much.
Well, hi, everybody. This is full circle for me. I was a CPEXer a very long time ago, so it's really exciting to be back here. One, because without one conversation with Boo Thomas, who used to run CPEX, and I know still is attending this. Luckily, she's not in the room, so there's not as much pressure for me. I would not have found my career and my calling, and so it's really, really exciting to be back here. Now, of course, my focus is housing, so if you were trying to choose between the two sessions and didn't know which one to go to, luckily I'm going to squeeze in some housing. I am feeling like what I'm going to talk about is a very small part of Louisiana's greenhouse gas emissions, but still a very important one. I will try to hit on some resources that can be used across sectors, of course, but I work for HUD, so I can't really justify a trip without talking about housing. So I'm just thinking about to our session, an hour or so ago. Why are we doing this? You're going to start hearing me spout off all this bureaucratic language or what else I'm going to talk about, but we're doing this for the residents of, especially in my case, HUD-assisted housing. I work very closely with my colleagues across the building, but we're talking about our communities here. And most importantly, a big focus of ours, and I know all of yours, is ensuring that kind of those communities, especially, and housing where there's been disinvestment over time, that they are helping to be part of the solution. And we're also in that same time creating healthy, exciting, well-designed housing for the families that occupy it. So you can read the slide, right? We're here for the climate as well, but I'm gonna always return back to the people because I know that's primarily why we're all in the room, or at least I am. So I saw this graphic at a recent conference. It was really striking to me. I'm not going to try to explain how it's created, but it's really about the capital markets. What spoke to me was the fact that we really need to retrofit our existing buildings, and this is beyond just housing, right? Because that's going to be those are going to be the buildings we have in 2050. 80% of the housing stock we have right now is going to be the same housing stock and the same building stock we have well into the future. Why that's important, especially for what I'm talking about today, I'm talking a lot about retrofits and what we need to do there. Of course, I've kind of put HUD on the line too. We finally have information about our portfolio and just how much the portfolio that HUD supports is causing in terms of GHG emissions. So it's actually equivalent to, you see, the total economy-wide emissions of 81 different countries. So we've got a responsibility too there as part of in the federal space. So luckily for you, I'm not gonna just talk to you about HUD money because admittedly, HUD didn't get that much money under the recent legislation. So there was, of course, bill, or some people call it the IIJA. I don't know why some people call things one thing and another. And then I'm going to focus today on the IRA because that's what I talk about, or IRA, as some people call it. So I'm going to talk about programs across several agencies that I think, right, we want to talk about money that we have now. This is a significant moment in time. I should have had a slide on that, but the number of resources we have right now to tackle this through this legislation is just quite incredible. It's still not going to be enough, admittedly, but it's a lot more than we've ever had before. And so I maybe this is the bureaucrat in me, but I think of different funding sources in different ways, and you probably do too, right? We've got tax credits. One thing I find most exciting as I'm going around talking about those, although none of us get really excited about thinking about our taxes or tax credits, but a lot of those, I'm thinking of them as resources where we all have access and there's really no limit to our ability to access those. They're not going to run out. So that's my kind of federal way of thinking about appropriated dollars. Tax credits, let's talk about why those are so relevant, right? Rebates, appropriated dollars in my way, they're going to be finite, but they're still really exciting and you can access them for financing projects. Usually get the money, afterwards, right? But there are some cases now where you can get them up front. And then grants and loans, that's typical what I talk about every day. And so I'm going to start to talk about the HUD program that we got, but also some of the other grant and loan funding opportunities that are really, really exciting, including specific ones that more recently have been announced in Louisiana, either the state or other communities are getting them. So what I get most excited about talking about is a program that I helped lead the design of until most recently in the implementation. HUD did get $1 billion through the IRA. So most of this money is going towards what we call the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. You're going to see in another slide why I was particularly excited when CPEX asked me to come, because I am still trying to beat the bushes to get some applications out of the state of Louisiana. So let's talk about that. They're pretty short timelines now to get into the program, but I'm hoping that some folks in this room can help me figure out who to talk to get some applications in. So what is GRRP? Because we've got to do an acronym for it, and this is not an easy one to say, but this is focused on multifamily assisted housing. So that's not going to be everyone, that's not every HUD program. These are privately owned, but usually that's by nonprofits. Section 8 assisted, project-based rental assistance contracts, or those properties. Section 202, housing for the elderly, and Section 811, housing for persons with disabilities. So there is a particular kind of focus point and target that we are working through on this program. But the exciting thing and what I loved most about kind of thinking through this program was it's the first program that I know of at the federal space that looks at both making multifamily housing more resilient while also increasing energy efficiency on site. We've never done that before, and so it was really, really fun to think through and design this. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I will look back on time and be really excited about what we hopefully will learn through the administration of this program. So this is back to my point. Louisiana we have had no awards and very few applications from the state. I can tell you there are HUD-assisted properties. I can show you them. I can send you a spreadsheet if you'd like, especially if you sign up to help me try to recruit someone to apply. But we've actually, for the first time, HUD has gotten almost all the money. We've got 50% of the money out the gate. We kind of designed and implemented this program in record time, at least for a federal agency. And we will be awarding all the funding probably by the early fall, and all the applications for kind of the final round. We've made it really difficult on ourselves. We have 12 different rounds of applications, all in the course of 18 months. The final applications are due between the spring and summer. And so just quickly, and hopefully this is applicable, but one thing I really enjoyed about doing this, designing this program, was what HUD tried to do here was meet our property owners where they were in terms of thinking through their property. For us, it was also an equity issue, because traditionally I'll say, at least from my perspective, and mine has been at Hilly, not as a member of the HUD team, but I think a lot of federal applications, we make it very cumbersome to be able to apply and access funds. I can probably look at the two people on stage right now who've just been through this in several different ways. So, you can count, sometimes there's 60 pages of narratives due for a federal application. So when we first started designing this program, we were really thinking from an equity lens, how could we make it easy to access for especially kind of our small mom and pop property owners to get a large amount of financing. So that's where we came up with the comprehensive award around, which actually about $80,000 per unit in a property. That adds up to quite a bit of money, up to $20 million per property for those comprehensive awards. And the really unique thing about that one is a HUD contractor will support the owner through all the assessments they need to do to figure out what are the resiliency needs and the most cost-effective resiliency improvements, doing kind of the environmental review, doing the energy audit. So HUD is actually going to pay for all of that. And that application, I've heard, can take only an afternoon. if the owner has done a couple things in advance. So I'm not going to go through the program in depth just because I want to get to some of the other resources that are probably more broadly applicable. But if you do know of assisted housing in your community, especially that needs basic capital improvements, a lot of this stock was built between the 60s and the 80s. This is a great resource, not just for greening and making a property more climate resilient, but doing basic capital improvements to improve the quality of the life of the residents who live there. So just to flash up the due dates for the final round of applications, just in case anybody's already thinking about a property in their community. And I'll come back to these if we have more time, but one really neat thing before I leave about especially the comprehensive round, which is where we're awarding most of the money, just for the other government officials in the room. What we did is it's the first time I know of where HUD is awarding funds based primarily on need, and need created by two scores in two systems. One is the FEMA National Risk Index, which actually gives we can get a score out of it for what your resiliency needs and how exposed to natural hazards you are. So literally we're giving properties a score on the NRI, which they can find right now. And then two, we're having them either do utility benchmarking through EPA's portfolio manager to see how inefficient their building is, or we've created an alternative because it's very difficult across a lot of the country to get the information you need to utility benchmark your building, especially multifamily. But if you can get these two scores, we are then looking at the score, and then based on that, if you are seen as the property with the highest need, you're getting an award. That's really unique, and I'm always trying to kind of tout that example because I'm hopeful going to the future that we're going to make it easier and easier for folks to access these resources based on need, not based on their ability to hire a grant writer or plan that many months in advance. So a few other things that HUD has created. One is we have a new Build for the Future site. This actually brings in both kind of statewide, local, federal resources where you can actually kind of search based on what kind of project you're targeting, and it will bring up information about the various funding sources across all of this space, so across the federal, local, and statewide space. We're making some improvements to make it even easier to use, but there are not that many tools out there which kind of tell you everything all at once and when the next application period is or when it's open. So just wanted to make sure I note that here. That's a great tool. Also for that same universe of properties, for those of you who have them in your community, HUD is also providing a free benchmarking service. So we're actually providing and paying for someone to go out and go to a property, figure out how inefficient or what the efficiency needs are at the property, so that an owner can think about what they need to invest in going forward. So again, this is something that would cost an owner possibly maybe $5,000+ a year, and HUD will do it for them for free so they can better understand their building's utility usage. So again, for any properties in Louisiana, I want to make sure I'm telling you about this. The value to HUD is that we're actually going to know about close to half of our building stock in this portfolio at the end of this process, which will help us plan for how we make future investments. And because we're in Louisiana, I couldn't help but talk about, we've created a new tool through this whole program that is the first tool of its kind to look at multifamily housing and figure out what are the most cost-effective resiliency improvements that need to take place at that property based on the natural hazards at that specific site. We're piloting this with the new program, but then it will be broadly available. So I just can't not talk about it. And we're also, well, I shouldn't just say because we're in Louisiana, we're anywhere in the United States right now, that we also created a kind of disaster preparedness plan template that you can use if you do have multifamily buildings in your community. We've gotten pretty good feedback from owners and public housing authorities who are using it this time. Okay, so let's go on to all the money that isn't at my agency that I love to talk about. And hopefully my 5-minute thing is not even close because this is my focus. So one thing, let's go back to tax credits, right? Where we all like to glaze over, and I'm not gonna talk about how we set up a tax credit entity. But right now, under the IRA, the base credit of 30% has been reestablished for kind of wind and solar projects. This is really exciting, but it's more exciting, especially when we're talking for those of you who are kind of working in the local government or nonprofit space. The IRA expanded the ability of entities that don't have tax liability, so you at nonprofits and local governments, to actually get what's called direct pay. So you don't file with the IRS, right, because you don't owe taxes, but now the IRS and Treasury will pay you that tax credit. So now you can access something that you were never able to access before. We'll get into why that matters, but that's super exciting. There's also a new concept. I'm not going to talk too much about it because we're still waiting on a lot of the regulations. But transferability is the ability now. So you can wait to get the payment for the tax credit at the end of your kind of installation of your project, or there's now the ability that you can kind of convert that to upfront equity through a much easier kind of setup of a tax credit structure. So that's another way you can help fund the upfront cost of your project. These are all new under the IRA. The other huge thing under the IRA were the bonuses. Now, in addition to the 30% base credit, so that's 30% of your project costs are paid for through the tax incentive, you can get bonuses. So that can actually add up, in some cases, up to 75 or 70% of that project cost can fully be covered by the federal government, right? Let's talk about why, and first I'm gonna go to this one and then I'm gonna go back. I was having dinner with a friend who I hadn't seen in 10 years last night and got really excited. And I said, have you seen that almost the entirety of the state of Louisiana is technically an energy community? What does that mean? On top of that 30%, if you are in these areas that are purple or the orange or yellow, oh, I got 2 minutes now, I gotta go fast. You can get an extra 10%, so you've now gotten from 30 to 40%. I'll go back to, if you're working in a low-income community, there's something called, we're calling it the low-income adder, because we've got to create a name for everything. That can be up to another 10 to 20% of a bonus on top of that 30% base credit. You do have to apply for this because there's kind of a maximum each year, but if you're interested, come talk to me after since I'm down to 2 minutes. Quickly, the state energy, okay, I got time for a breath. Each of the state energy offices, including Louisiana, have access to rebates, both for single family and multifamily housing, both to kind of encourage electrification and appliances, and also do kind of home efficiency, full kind of renovations on units. The state, I believe, has at least accessed the money to kind of start planning for this, but they do have to actively apply. So if you're wanting to know where Louisiana in this process is, I'd encourage you to call the state energy office or wherever that's located in the state. I can look that up. And you can track where it is in applying with the links in my slides, or I can give it to you. Other really exciting thing, and this is gonna be a ton of money that will make really transformative investments in communities, not just for housing, but across the board. EPA has the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Over the last 3 weeks, they've made the announcements of all of the awards under this kind of $27 billion fund. A lot of the money is being pushed out through, or all of it is being pushed out through intermediaries. So community development financial institutions or banks, kind of credit unions, and kind of, I know that this is kind of a typical list of those who have already been occupying the space, but suddenly there's a huge influx of capital that they can now use to fund projects in communities, not just housing, but kind of larger scale, schools, you name it, a lot of these funds are gonna tackle it. And the great thing too, although people get excited about grants, I get excited about loans. A lot of these are gonna be very soft loans or very low interest loans so that these organizations can start to recycle it, right? And use it over and over again. So it's not gonna be a one-time investment. And also with this, we're hoping that this will push kind of the private sector and the markets to start investing more and more in greening and doing energy efficiency work. And one other plug for Louisiana, I think some of you probably heard the announcement, but the last kind of round of awards that were announced were the Solar for All awards that were made this Monday, and Louisiana did, the Department of Natural Resources did get it, and I think y'all have rebranded it calling Solar for Y'all. This is focused primarily on residential solar, as you would guess. And then you can just see, this is one example of one of the entities that got one of the funding and kind of the different things we're working on. So a lot of these hit on both Tom and Lakeisha's, like what the focuses are in Louisiana. We've got transportation, and then you can see the kind of variety of projects they're gonna start to fund across the US. And here is just an example of how you could overwhelmingly start to pay for a solar project just with the resources I've talked about here and putting very little of your own money up if you were a multifamily owner. And I promised more leveraging slides, but because so many of these resources are so new, a bunch of my requests to get slides on how these resources could be rated came through exactly 2 days after my final deadline to submit these slides. But I do have examples now where communities actually are starting to pair these new resources together. It's really, really exciting. And that is it. Oops.
Okay, well, I have time for a Q&A. If I encourage you, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Anybody? Yes, Mark. There's a mic coming. If you want to just wait a second.
There was a point, I believe, in the New Orleans program about, excuse me, congestion mitigation, and usually that means expanding roadways. Are there other ways to do that?
Absolutely. And in fact, in our climate plan, but also in all of our planning generally, we treat expanding roadway capacity as a method of last resort. There are a lot of other ways to address congestion. One of which being simple operational improvements, traffic signal optimization, things like that, geometric improvements. Also, travel demand management programs, things like carpooling, van pooling, work from home, where we've all seen has had a pretty significant impact on congestion. So I think we do pretty explicitly state in the climate plan and all of our transportation planning products that capacity expansion should kind of be after you look at everything else and you can see that that's not going to work, then we will do capacity expansion.
Hello. Along those same lines, you had outlined some investments for carbon capture in Southeast Louisiana. Can you talk a little bit about the infrastructure, and would that infrastructure also be part of long-term planning that the RPC is undertaking, whether through the TIP or any other long-term plan?
Yeah, it's interesting. Most of our funding is transportation related, which does not necessarily fund a lot of carbon capture. And in fact, up until very recently, it was not necessarily prohibited, but really not allowed to do things like that. So just talking about our transportation funding specifically, in the bill or IIJA, depending on who you're talking to, it does now allow our kind of traditional pot of transportation funding to be used for green infrastructure, for resilience improvements, but it also introduced a lot of other new funding sources that could be used for the same things. So that's the transportation side of things. At the RPC specifically, we do have a few other programs that could be used for that. We have a brownfields program that we're talking about, perhaps introducing some more concepts like that into our redevelopment of brownfields. We also work with Louisiana Watershed Initiative, which is providing funding for mainly flood mitigation projects, but we're hoping to be able to use that for things like, again, green infrastructure. Our agency does not specifically work on the larger scale things like marsh restoration, shoreline building, that kind of stuff. But a lot of our parishes are very interested in that. In fact, I'd say all of our parishes are very interested in that and actively pursuing it in some form or another.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first is for Tom. You briefly mentioned work from home as a solution or possible easement of transportation issues, but housing didn't really appear, but that goes hand in hand, right? Where you live and where you work. Is that at all on the meter for transportation easement?
So our discussions on housing mainly revolved around building energy efficiency and incentive programs for either landlords or property owners themselves. So that was our discussion around housing. However, are you referring to, access to internet or access just a safe and comfortable place to work? Is that
I mostly mean the distance between where one lives and one works.
Yeah.
To even necessitate a car or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of access to a workplace, I do think that could be greatly be enhanced both through the public transit improvements, things like BRT, which was specifically discussed in our program, but also walking and biking improvements. So I think, those are kind of the three prongs, I guess, to accessing work without use of an automobile.
Yeah, my question is like making housing more livable closer to centers of work,
Okay.
or
okay.
bridging the gap between
Okay.
where one works if it's in a refinery or further away in a more single family owner population versus in a city center, things like that.
Yes. Okay. So more of like a land use kind of perspective on it.
Correct.
Yeah. So our climate plan didn't necessarily get into that. However, some of our other planning products do. But I think that's definitely something that we can take back. I very much appreciate that comment, and I think it is something that we could be more explicit about in the comprehensive plan.
Thank you. And my next question is for Lakeisha. What are some of the most motivating incentives on the state level for industry, especially given some of the industries that come to mind as kind of like hard to incentivize already, sometimes receive up to 99% tax abatement through tax incentive programs already. So what are some of the most motivating incentives for those industries?
I would say it's still money. I think from the perspective of them being a business owner, the things that we heard, and honestly, the folks that we talked to in industry really were interested in partnerships. They really were open to having conversations about the acknowledgement of their contribution to some of the issues. And so we didn't really get hit with a lot of pushback. Things that we heard were, honestly, they are aware this is a global issue. They already are sometimes further down the road than we thought towards being a better actor than they have been previously. And when you look at the issue being a global scale, the impacts in Louisiana do matter just because of our political climate is very open to industry. And so a lot of times the projects will start here and then kind of branch out in other places. But we did hear like there is this hump that most of them did need to get over from a financial perspective in order to make some of these more advanced technologies economically feasible. And the challenge really is where does the state play the role and how do we balance, funding industry versus putting funding into the community. And so our Priority Climate Action Plan is super broad intentionally because we have to consider impacts across the state, across various sectors, but always acknowledge that industry is our number one contributor. We also did hear that they are super interested in how they could advance improvements in and around their facilities. And so even things like buffer zones, they were interested in, and I think that it's just really important to allow people to be in a space where we can all have conversations and be honest and open with each other about this is really where I see my role versus, there's the utopian society where everybody is on board with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then there's the reality where we live, where sometimes if the money isn't there, if there's a certain political affiliation or a certain belief or disbelief in the science, that people are not going to be, our assumption that people are not going to be open to conversation. But I think we really need to continue to have conversations like this again, meet people where they are. And as a state, if it's funding an industry and also figuring out how to provide funding for community resilience hubs, then that's what we have to do. But yeah, we heard that it was the funding was the key, I think, challenge in those that really had the innovation and the technology there, but just did not have that string of funding to connect the dot to make it something that they were at this point willing to proceed in implementing.
I would add to that that most global companies have by now probably ESG goals, environmental, social, and governance goals that speak to getting away from the status quo of operation and demonstrating to their investors that they are committed to a brighter, better future, a sustainable future. And so I think a lot of their businesses are already, the goals are laid out. I think the job on us is to figure out what their investors are requesting of them in terms of how they continue their operations, and us meeting them somewhere there where we all reach our goals. Well, I have a question. So I saw in the, and this is, I'm referencing an action that was outlined in the New Orleans PCAP. But I'm just wondering, there's a lot of emphasis on reducing waste, recycling, composting, but I feel like I don't even know who I would turn to actually start a program. We have also talked and also because it's at the household level to some degree, it's very hard to reach people, and then there's an educational component. So I'm just wondering, like, which one of these actions, just thinking about the composting one, is actually like the easiest to implement now to start progress.
I don't know if there was even anything else. But so for composting, that conversation really largely revolved around community groups and nonprofits. It wasn't so much about, the city of New Orleans or Jefferson Parish needs to establish a community composting program, but more along the lines of how can we give assistance or incentives to our existing urban farming organizations and youth farming organizations. We have, things like GrowDat and City Park. How can we help them to build kind of composting hubs where people can bring their composting? If you're in or around New Orleans, you might be familiar with Glass Half Full, the recycling program for glass. They've been very successful. Maybe we can establish something like that for composting. So that's kind of where that conversation really centered around, not so much as that being a government program, but as how can we do this at the community and neighborhood level.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about the emissions that food waste in general produces. Mm-hmm. It's quite a lot that could be, yeah.
If New Orleans does want to start a program, DC just did a pilot, and I'm actually one of they're like 10% of each households in each of our wards is participating. I will say before that, too, a lot of my neighbors would take their food waste to farmers markets every week. I'm still remembering the Red Stick one that I passed by the other day. I was like, should I extend my trip so I can stay for the Red Stick farmers market? But just an idea, just sharing ideas as a citizen here. So.
And then, are there any questions from the audience? And then I was also wondering, I noticed that there wasn't a whole lot of public input or opportunities for input, and stakeholders primarily and other groups, I guess, and governmental groups were part of developing these actions and measures. And I'm just wondering why, and if there is, what's the opportunity for the future to be inclusive?
Yeah, that's definitely a fair question, and something that we struggled with a lot in the beginning of this process. The first reason is kind of what I was describing with the PCAP, that in the projects we were identifying, we were trying to make them eligible for implementation funding. The agencies that would apply for that were all government agencies. So that was the first part of it. The second part of it had a lot more to do with our timeline for developing the plan and what we want to get out of public engagement, because we want to do very robust and meaningful public engagement, particularly with disadvantaged communities. We received our grant funding on September 1st of 2023, and our PCAP had to be turned into the EPA on March the 1st of 2024. So about 7 months from getting our grant paperwork to completing the plan. That meant we had to learn to do things like a greenhouse gas inventory that we've never done before, identify all these projects, et cetera, et cetera. We also did not feel like that gave us time to even get a consultant to help out with that. That would have taken up 3 months of it. It also included the holidays and Mardi Gras. All that to say that we did not feel like we could have done meaningful public engagement in that time. And I mean meaningful. Yes, we could have had some public meetings, put something in the newspaper, on the website, but that's not meaningful. And I've been involved in bad public engagement before. It's not fun, and it makes the community lose trust in your work. In fact, I just brought up GRODAT. City Park in New Orleans has been going through a master planning process with some public engagement. There were some proposals related to GRODAT in City Park that a lot of people were upset with. A lot of people were not pleased with the City Park's engagement process during their master planning. And they've had to take a step back and say, we're going to try to restart this. We're going to reboot a little bit and redo things. We did not want to be in a situation like that with the PCAP. So what we did is we kind of took the PCAP and we said, this is a preliminary first step plan. It's to identify projects that could be eligible for this first round of funding, but this is going to set us up for the future, for the CCAP, the comprehensive plan. So the CCAP, the first thing that we have done for developing that plan is write a public engagement strategy. And we are going to be having a very robust outreach through that. I think that is going to be really the main focus, at least for the first several months of that plan's development. Now that we have gotten kind of the GHG inventory under our belt, we've kind of done the government outreach. Now we can just keep that going. So the public outreach is going to be really the main focus, especially through the first couple months of developing that plan. So.
Okay, I have a last question. Oh, wait, there's one in the audience. Great.
So, I guess I'm thoughtful about the word intersection, right? It's one we've all been using a lot. And broadband came up a little bit in talking about going remote. I'm thinking about the reactivity we kind of have to have in Louisiana. Per the hurricane season is starting to become even more of an issue with flood change and all of that. And so I guess I'm thinking about this year, but then moving forward, what ways do you all imagine having to build partnerships with other departments, and how should we be preparing ourselves to have conversations with people, like not siloed conversations, as we think about things like this?
I would say just from a state level, in and through all of the programs that we're looking at developing, that resilience piece, it has to be a part of it across even the community scale projects. We have to think about what does this look like pre and post disaster. In some of our plans, we have strategically called out, as we implement this, what does it look like if people are evacuating due to a storm? We're looking at infrastructure as far as EV and just those broader conversations. We cannot have those conversations in Louisiana without talking about what does this look like day one after a storm, day two, day 10. And so I think that in and through all of these processes across various state agencies. We just have to keep that front of mind and incorporate that resilience, redundancy piece in all of our implementation programs.
I'd add that the opportunity to get to speak to sectors that I don't usually work in, departments I don't usually work with, has been one of the best things about this entire process. I've spent most of my career in transportation and land use, touching on a few things here and there, but I've already learned so much more about who's doing what in our region. I've never sat on a panel and talked about composting before, but
You're welcome.
that wasn't ever part of what I did. But now we are starting to really make those connections, and hopefully it's not just us talking to all these people. Hopefully they're talking to each other as well through this process. So that's been really good.
And I know I'm not at the local level, but I will say, especially, and I referenced a few of the big dollar amounts that are flowing through the state, I would encourage groups like CPEX and others of you who are here to make sure that those offices who are administering them are talking to each other and not creating things that are conflicting, and also where they can streamlining requirements, right? I will say it was really exciting with the IRA that HUD for the first time was talking to DOE and Treasury and actually made sure that like certain HUD properties or HUD programs were automatically considered eligible, right? So people weren't going to have to do another thing to prove that that was like a low income building, right? So we did these things that hopefully will streamline, and now even on a regular basis, actually, I'm talking to folks at DOE and Treasury every 2 weeks where we're highlighting, hey, this is where we can continue streamlining to make it easier for the states or those who are trying to. So do not, if you know someone or if you are having struggles, like raise them, because there are many of us who are trying to fix these things where we can, especially if they're like what we call a sub-regulatory level.
And I know I got the stop card, but I'll just say this because I can. It's really important at the very, very local, like residential level, to, as a community, have a common vision that can be communicated to the people like Lakeisha or Tom, and possibly even Bennett in this instance, if the application goes to her desk. But it helps in understanding where the community wants to go in the future and where it wants to be and what their priorities are, and that's usually done through planning. And luckily, CPEX does planning, so it's not a plug necessarily for us, but it is so helpful for the community to just come together and identify what their vision for the future is, and that's all I wanted to say, because it's a break coming up, and I wanted to thank you all for being here, and I don't want you all to miss Jay Darden's Why Louisiana Ain't Mississippi or any place else. And that's going to be followed by a reception. And after that, I hope you all stay for the Pechacucha, or Pechacucha, I think it's also called. It's going to be amazing. And I hope you can stay. And thank you for attending this panel. Thank you to our speakers as well.